The richest man in that store looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Somewhere warm, I hope. Because the winter that rolled through Blackwater Ridge in 1883 was the kind that cracked wagon wheels, froze cattle standing up, and made grown men whisper prayers into their whiskey glasses after sundown. The storm started before noon. By evening, snow had buried the boardwalks under nearly a foot of white ice, and every soul in town crowded into Whitmore Mercantile just to stay near the heat. The store smelled of wet wool, cedar shelves, cigar smoke, and coffee left too long above the stove. Men laughed loudly that night. Rich men always laughed louder when the weather turned cruel outside. Clara Whitmore stood behind the front counter wrapping lantern glass in old newspaper while her father argued prices beside the register. She was 28, sharp-eyed, quiet, the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed. And that was why she noticed the stranger before anyone else did. The front door opened slow at first, like the wind itself was pushing against it. Then it burst inward with a howl of snow so cold the lantern flames trembled. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway covered in white frost from hat brim to boots. Snow clung to his shoulders and beard. One glove was missing. His coat looked 20 years old and stiff with frozen sleet. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then someone near the stove chuckled. "Hell," another man muttered. "Looks like winter finally dragged in its last victim." A few people laughed under their breath. The stranger removed his hat slowly. His hand shook from cold so badly he nearly dropped it. Water dripped from his boots onto the wooden floorboards. Clara saw his eyes move across the room once. Calm, tired, not begging, never begging. Her father frowned immediately. "Store closes in an hour," he said flatly. "If you ain't buying, don't stand blocking my heat." The stranger nodded once, but said nothing. He stepped inside anyway. Men shifted away from him as he passed. A woman pinched her nose dramatically. Someone whispered that he smelled like horse sweat and railroad smoke. But Clara kept watching his hands. Rough hands, scarred hands, not a drifter's hands. The kind shaped by rains, cold iron, and years carrying responsibility heavier than most men could stand. The stranger paused beside the cast-iron stove for barely 2 seconds before a banker in a gray coat snapped. "Move along there, friend. Some of us paid to stay warm tonight." More laughter. The man stepped away without complaint. That was the strange part. Proud men argued. Weak men apologized. But this one did neither. He simply walked deeper into the store while melting snow followed behind him in quiet little drops. Then he stopped in front of the finest blanket Clara's father carried. Red wool, thick as a winter saddle pad. Imported from Boston 3 months earlier. $32 cash. Clara remembered because her father bragged about the price every chance he got. The stranger reached out slowly and touched the edge of the blanket between 2 rough fingers. Almost gentle. Then he asked, in a voice dry as old leather, "How much for this one?" The room exploded with laughter. The laughter rolled through Whitmore Mercantile like smoke curling along the ceiling beams. Men slapped their knees. One woman covered her mouth with a gloved hand to hide her grin. Even old Mr. Dobbins near the pickle barrels let out a dry wheeze that sounded like a rusty hinge. Clara did not laugh. She watched the stranger instead. He still stood there in silence with snow melting off the brim of his hat and dripping onto the floorboards around his boots. The red blanket rested beneath his rough hand, bright against the dark shelves like a coal glowing inside a dying fire. Her father stepped closer to the counter with a crooked smile. "Mister," he said loudly enough for the whole store to hear, "that blanket costs $32 cash. Not trade. Not promises. Cash." Another round of laughter spread through the room. The stranger nodded once as if the number meant something only to him. "I heard you," he said quietly. His voice carried dust and winter in it. Low, steady, not embarrassed. That was what unsettled Clara most. Men humiliated in public usually shrank or barked back. This man did neither. He simply stood there like cold wind against stone. A tall rancher beside the stove smirked into his whiskey cup. "You planning to sleep under that thing?" he asked. "Or sell it back by morning for liquor money?" More laughter. The stranger ignored him completely. Clara noticed his eyes drift toward the front window instead. Snow hammered against the glass in white waves. Outside, the street lantern flickered weakly beside the hitching rail. And there, barely visible through the storm, stood a little girl wrapped in thin rags with no coat at all. She could not have been older than 8. Her arms folded tightly against herself while snow gathered in her dark hair. The stranger stared at her for only a second before looking back at the blanket. "Cold night for a child," he murmured. Nobody answered him. Her father crossed his arms. "If you are buying, buy. If not, move aside for paying customers." Slowly, the stranger slid his hand into the inside pocket of his coat. The movement drew every eye in the room. People expected loose coins, maybe crumpled bills. Instead, something heavy landed on the wooden counter with a sharp metallic crack that cut straight through the laughter. Silence followed instantly. Clara looked down. Gold. Old gold. Bigger than a standard eagle coin. The lantern light reflected off its worn surface in deep yellow flashes. Her father picked it up carefully. His expression changed before he could stop it. Clara saw color leave his face little by little. The coin carried an old railroad stamp, nearly vanished from age. She had only seen one like it before in her father's private lockbox upstairs. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. The stranger brushed melting snow from his sleeve. "Earned it." Nobody laughed now. Even the rancher by the stove lowered his eyes. Clara noticed something else then. Burn scars crossed the stranger's wrist beneath his coat sleeve. Old scars. Deep ones. The kind left by hot iron or exploding lantern oil years earlier. He caught Clara looking at them. For the first time since entering the store, their eyes met. His were pale gray, calm, tired beyond words. But beneath the exhaustion sat something else. Authority. The kind men carried when they had once been obeyed without raising their voice. Then the stranger looked toward Clara's father again and asked a question so strange the whole room seemed to stop breathing. "You still keep the old debt ledger behind this counter?" The question settled over the store heavier than the storm outside. Nobody moved. The crackling stove suddenly sounded loud enough to fill the whole building. Clara saw her father's fingers tighten around the gold coin until his knuckles turned pale. "What did you say?" he asked carefully. The stranger brushed snow from the shoulder of his coat and repeated himself without changing expression. "The old debt ledger. You still keep it." A few men near the stove exchanged uneasy looks. Most people in Blackwater Ridge had heard stories about that ledger. Old ranch debts, railroad loans, winter supply accounts from 20 years earlier back when the town was little more than mud streets and hungry families trying not to freeze to death. Clara remembered seeing the thick leather book once as a child hidden beneath the counter downstairs. Her father never liked anyone touching it. "That ledger is private business," he said sharply. "Why?" The stranger glanced toward the front window again. The little girl outside had curled beside the hitching rail, trying to shield herself from the wind. Snow covered her shoulders now. Clara swallowed hard. Nobody else inside seemed willing to notice the child. Warm rooms made people selfish in winter. The stranger looked back at the blanket. "Because I remember paying for this store before your shelves were even built." Silence. Absolute silence. One man near the coffee grinder gave a nervous laugh, but it died quickly when nobody joined him. Clara stared at the stranger more carefully now. Beneath the frost and road dust, his coat had once been expensive. The stitching along the collar was hand-finished. His boots were worn nearly through, but good leather once cost money like that. And his voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. Her father set the coin down slowly. "What is your name?" The stranger did not answer right away. He removed the remaining glove from his hand finger by finger, stiff from cold. Burn scars crossed his wrist and disappeared beneath his sleeve. Clara felt something pull at the back of her memory. Somewhere she had seen those scars before. Somewhere important. The stranger rested his bare hand on the counter. "Names do not matter much after enough winters," he said quietly. "But debts usually do." The rancher by the stove scoffed. "You expect us to believe you own this place?" The stranger turned his head slightly toward him. Calm gray eyes. No anger. No pride. "No," he replied. "I expect nothing from any of you." The answer hit harder than shouting ever could. Clara saw several men lower their eyes into their cups. Outside, the wind screamed through the empty street. The lantern beside the hitching rail flickered weakly beneath the snow. Then the little girl outside stumbled. Just slightly, but enough for the stranger to notice immediately. He stepped toward the window without another word. Clara watched him carefully. Even limping from the cold, he moved with the instinct of a man used to watching over others first. He stood there for a long second staring at the child through the frosted glass, while warmth from the stove curled around the room behind him. Finally, he spoke again, almost to himself. Same kind of winter. Clara frowned. What do you mean? The stranger kept his eyes on the storm. The winter people forget each other. Something in Clara's chest tightened. Her father suddenly disappeared behind the counter without a word. Wooden drawers slid open beneath the register. Paper shifted. Metal clinked softly. Then came the sound of something heavy being dragged across wood. The rancher near the stove straightened slowly. Walter, he muttered to Clara's father, you are not seriously getting that book. But her father did not answer. He rose back into view carrying a thick leather ledger coated in years of dust. And the moment the stranger saw it, the tiredness in his eyes changed into something far older than anger. The old ledger looked heavier than a church Bible. Dust rolled off its cracked leather cover as Walter Whitmore lowered it onto the counter. Between himself and the stranger, nobody in the store spoke. Even the wind outside seemed farther away now, muffled behind thick walls and growing unease. Clara had seen that book only twice in her life. Once when she was 10 years old, and her father slammed it shut the moment she entered the room. The second time came after her mother died, when Walter spent half the night drinking beside the stove with the ledger open across his knees like it contained ghosts instead of numbers. He never explained why. The stranger stepped closer to the counter. Lantern light flickered across his face, revealing lines carved deep by weather and years spent outdoors. Up close, Clara noticed the gray in his beard was not the gray of old age alone. It was the gray men carried after surviving too much winter and too little kindness. Walter kept one hand resting on the book. This ledger contains private accounts, he said carefully. Names from a long time ago. The stranger nodded once. That is usually where the truth hides. A few customers shifted uncomfortably near the stove. Nobody wanted to leave now. Not after hearing that. Curiosity was stronger than the storm. Clara watched her father swallow hard before opening the ledger slowly. The spine groaned with age. Yellowed pages filled with faded ink appeared beneath the lantern glow. Dates, supplies, ranch loans, feed orders, railroad credits. Entire winters buried in handwriting. Walter flipped through page after page with stiff fingers while the stranger waited in complete silence. Then Clara noticed something strange. Her father was nervous. Truly nervous. She had seen him argue with railroad men twice his size and bankers from Denver without blinking once. But now sweat glistened along his temple despite the cold. What exactly are you looking for? Walter finally asked. The stranger stared down at the pages. Winter of 1863. Several older men in the room lifted their heads immediately. Everyone in Blackwater Ridge knew stories about that winter. Crops froze before harvest. Supply wagons vanished in the mountain pass. Families burned furniture just to survive the nights. Some people left town and never returned. Others stayed only because someone helped them. Clara remembered hearing whispers about it as a child, always spoken softly when adults thought children were asleep. Walter flipped farther into the ledger until his movements slowed, then stopped. His eyes locked onto something written near the bottom of the page. The color drained from his face completely. Clara leaned forward instinctively, trying to read upside down from where she stood. One line had been marked darker than the others, as if someone had traced over it years later. Winter Emergency Supply Credit. Amount owed, $14,000. Creditor, E. Boone. Clara frowned. Boone. The name struck somewhere deep inside her memory like a distant bell. The stranger looked at the page for a long moment without expression. Then he asked quietly, still unpaid. Nobody breathed. Walter opened his mouth once, but no words came out. Finally he managed. We all thought you were dead. A rancher near the stove muttered under his breath. Boone? Another older man suddenly straightened so fast his chair scraped against the floorboards. His eyes widened at the stranger. Dear God, he whispered. Elias Boone. The room turned colder than the storm outside. Clara felt it instantly. The name moved through the store like wind under a door. Elias Boone. She knew it now. Every child in Blackwater Ridge had heard the story once. The cattleman who brought food wagons through the mountains during the famine winter. The man who vanished after the railroad fire nearly 20 years ago. Most believed he died in the snow somewhere west of Cheyenne. Clara looked back at the stranger standing quietly beside the counter in his frozen coat and worn boots. And for the first time that night, she realized every man in the room had been laughing at the person who once kept their families alive. No one laughed anymore. The warmth inside Whitmore Mercantile had changed into something tight and uncomfortable, like the room itself had become too small for the truth sitting at the counter. Elias Boone stood motionless beside the ledger while snowmelt dripped from the edge of his coat onto the floorboards below him. The sound echoed in the silence. Clara watched the older men in the store carefully. Faces that had once carried amusement now looked pale beneath the lantern light. Some stared at the floor. Others stared into the stove fire as though old memories had suddenly crawled out from beneath the flames. Walter Whitmore cleared his throat roughly. "People said the railroad fire killed you," he murmured. Elias looked down at the faded page in the ledger. "Almost did." His voice carried no pride in surviving, only weariness. Clara noticed the scars on his wrist again. Railroad burns. Suddenly the stories she heard as a little girl no longer sounded like stories at all. They sounded like this man standing quietly in front of her. One of the ranchers near the stove removed his hat slowly. "You really cross Carson Pass with food wagons during the famine winter?" Elias nodded once. 6 wagons. "In that storm?" another man asked softly. Elias looked toward the front window where snow still battered the glass. "Storms do not care whether men survive them." Nobody answered after that. Clara felt her chest tighten watching him. He had entered the store freezing, exhausted, treated like dirt by nearly everyone inside. Yet he stood there without bitterness. No anger. No need to shame anyone. That silence unsettled people more than shouting ever could. Walter glanced nervously at the debt amount written in the ledger again. $14,000. Enough money to buy half the buildings on Main Street 20 years earlier. With interest, maybe all of them now. "Elias," Walter said carefully, "about the debt." Elias raised one scarred hand slightly. Walter stopped talking immediately. "I did not come for money." The entire room seemed to breathe again at once. Clara noticed it instantly. Shoulders relaxed. Men exchanged relieved glances. One woman even let out a quiet, nervous laugh. Elias noticed too. His eyes moved slowly across the room before settling back on the red blanket folded beside the counter. "I came because a child outside is freezing." Those words landed harder than any accusation could have. Clara felt heat rise into her cheeks. Everyone in the store had seen the little girl through the window. Nobody moved. Nobody offered help. They had simply watched her suffer while standing beside warmth and coffee and shelves full of winter coats. Elias reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out folded bills, old but clean despite the storm. He placed them beside the gold coin. $32, he said quietly. Walter stared at the money without touching it. "You do not need to pay for anything here." Elias looked at him calmly. "A man pays his way." Then he lifted the red blanket from the counter with surprising care, almost like it mattered for reasons nobody else understood. Clara noticed his hands trembling harder now. Not fear. Cold. Real dangerous cold. The kind that reached bone. "You should stay near the stove a while," she said before she could stop herself. Elias turned toward her. Up close. His gray eyes looked even more exhausted than before. Snow still clung to the edges of his beard. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore," he replied softly. Hearing her name from his mouth startled her. "You know who I am?" A faint smile touched the corner of his face for the first time that night. "You have your mother's eyes." Clara froze completely. Her mother died 12 years earlier. Elias slowly folded the blanket over one arm and stepped toward the front door again. The entire store watched him move through the silence. Then, just before reaching the door, he stopped beside the stove and glanced once more at the ledger lying open on the counter. "Funny thing about debts," he said quietly. "Sometimes the people who owe the most money are not the poorest ones in the room." The words stayed hanging in the warm air long after Elias Boone turned toward the door. Nobody followed him. Nobody answered him. Men who had laughed at him less than 10 minutes earlier now stood frozen beside half-finished coffee cups and melting cigar ash. Clara watched Elias reach for the door handle with slow, stiff fingers, and for the first time that night, she noticed how badly the cold had truly worn him down. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of wet wool and years on the road. Snow had melted through parts of his coat entirely. The cuffs around his wrists looked nearly frozen solid. Yet he still carried the red blanket carefully over one arm like it mattered more than anything else in the room. Walter suddenly spoke behind him. "Elias." The older man stopped but did not turn around. Walter swallowed once before continuing. "You saved this town." Elias remained still beside the door. No, he replied quietly. I hauled food through a mountain pass. Folks saved themselves. That is not how people remember it. A faint smile crossed Elias's tired face. Sad more than proud. Memory changes once stomachs stay full long enough. Clara felt those words settle deep inside her chest. Around the stove, nobody could meet each other's eyes anymore. The rancher who mocked Elias earlier stared into the fire as though ashamed of hearing his own voice in his memory. Outside, the storm screamed harder against the windows. The little girl near the hitching rail had slid down beside a barrel now, trying to curl herself smaller against the wind. Elias opened the door. Freezing air exploded into the store again, rattling the lantern flames. Clara reacted before thinking. Wait. Elias paused. She hurried from behind the counter, grabbed a pair of thick wool gloves from a nearby shelf, and stopped in front of him. Up close, she could see tiny ice crystals caught in his beard. His face looked pale beneath the lantern glow. Take these too, she said softly. Elias glanced at the gloves, then at her. I cannot pay for more tonight. Clara shook her head. You already paid for this town once. The room went silent again after she said it. Walter lowered his eyes slowly. Elias looked at Clara for a long moment. Something old and tired softened in his expression then. You sound like your mother, he murmured. Clara barely breathed. You knew her well? Elias stared past her for a second, somewhere far beyond the walls of the mercantile. Long time ago, he said quietly. Back when this town still remembered how to look after people. Then he accepted the gloves carefully, almost reluctantly, like a man unaccustomed to receiving kindness himself. Outside, the wind howled through Main Street hard enough to shake the sign above the store. Elias stepped down onto the snow-covered boardwalk immediately. Clara moved closer to the doorway and watched him cross through the storm toward the little girl. The snow reached nearly to his boots now. Every gust pushed against him sideways. Yet he kept moving steadily until he reached the child beside the barrel. The girl looked terrified at first. Then Elias slowly knelt in the snow despite the cold and wrapped the red blanket around her shoulders with both careful hands. Clara could not hear what he said to the child through the storm, but she saw the little girl's face change. Fear disappearing, relief taking its place. Elias removed one of the new gloves Clara gave him and gently pulled it onto the child's tiny frozen hand instead. Behind Clara, nobody inside the store spoke a single word. Men who owned ranches, land, and bank accounts stood warm beside a roaring stove while the poorest man among them gave away the only thing he came to buy. Then the old rancher near the fire whispered something so quietly Clara almost missed it. Dear Lord, he muttered, staring through the window at Elias in the snow. We became the kind of people he warned us about. Snow swallowed Elias Boone almost immediately after he stepped away from the mercantile. The storm had thickened into a white wall drifting sideways through Main Street, coating wagon wheels, rooftops, and hitching posts beneath heavy ice. Clara remained near the doorway long after the cold forced other customers back toward the stove. She watched Elias kneel beside the little girl beneath the lantern glow while the red blanket wrapped around her tiny shoulders like warmth itself had finally found her. The child looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes at first, then slowly leaned closer as he spoke softly enough that only she could hear. Elias adjusted the blanket around her carefully, making certain it covered her feet too. Clara noticed the man's bare hand trembling violently now without the glove. The cold had turned his fingers pale red from frost. Yet he still gave the child the warmer glove and kept the thinner one for himself. Behind Clara, the store remained silent except for crackling firewood and the occasional creak of old floorboards. Nobody seemed eager to talk anymore. The same people who mocked Elias earlier now stood trapped inside their own thoughts. Finally, the rancher near the stove cleared his throat roughly. That little girl belongs to Martha Green, he muttered quietly. Walter looked up from the ledger. Widow Green. The rancher nodded. Her husband froze during the cattle drive last February. Clara closed her eyes briefly. She remembered Martha now. A tired woman living near the edge of town with 2 children and hardly enough coal to survive the season. Folks talked about helping every winter. Somehow help never arrived long enough to matter. Walter stared toward the front window where Elias still crouched beside the child in the snow. Why was nobody watching her? Nobody answered him. Because everybody knew the truth already. Hard winters made people look inward, toward their own homes, their own food, their own fires. Elias finally stood again outside, slower this time. Clara saw the exhaustion in his movements clearly now. The storm pushed hard against him as he steadied himself beside the hitching rail. For a brief moment, she thought he might fall. Instead, he rested one scarred hand gently atop the child's head before turning away into the snow-covered street. "Where is he going?" Clara whispered. Walter frowned toward the window. "No idea." Then old Mr. Dobbins near the pickle barrels suddenly spoke up from the shadows. "Rail station." Everyone looked toward him. The old man shifted his jaw thoughtfully. Boone always stayed near the freight yards after the famine winter. Railroad men said he slept beside supply crates more often than hotel beds. Clara's chest tightened. The idea of Elias Boone sleeping alone beside frozen rail cars while half the town sat warm inside their homes made something painful settle in her stomach. She glanced toward her father. Walter still stared at the ledger lying open across the counter. $14,000, he murmured under his breath. Good Lord. Clara looked down at the faded ink again. Why did he never collect the debt? Walter rubbed his tired eyes slowly. Because if he had, Blackwater Ridge would have collapsed before it ever became a town. Silence followed. Outside, Elias's figure faded farther into the storm beneath the weak lanterns lining Main Street. Then Clara noticed something else. He was limping. Not badly, just enough for someone paying attention to see it. The railroad burns. The years. The cold. The miles. Suddenly, she remembered the look in his eyes when he spoke about winter making people forget each other. That was not anger speaking. That was disappointment. The kind that came from watching goodness slowly disappear over time. Clara grabbed her coat from the hook beside the door immediately. Walter looked up sharply. Where are you going? She pulled the scarf around her neck without answering at first. Then she looked back toward the storm where Elias Boone had nearly vanished into the snow. Somebody ought to make sure the man who saved this town does not freeze outside it. The cold struck Clara the moment she stepped outside Whitmore Mercantile. Wind whipped snow across Main Street hard enough to sting her face and blur the lanterns into pale yellow smears through the storm. Behind her, warmth and firelight spilled briefly from the open door before it closed again with a dull wooden thud. Suddenly the whole town felt empty. Quiet. Like Blackwater Ridge itself was hiding from the winter. Clara pulled her coat tighter and searched through the drifting snow ahead until she finally spotted Elias Boone moving slowly down the street. His shoulders leaned against the wind with the tired determination of a man who had spent too many years traveling alone. One side of his body moved stiffly now. The limp was worse than before. Clara hurried after him carefully through the snow-covered boardwalk. "Mr. Boone," she called. Elias slowed but did not turn immediately. By the time Clara reached him near the railroad crossing, snow already covered the shoulders of his coat again. Up close beneath the weak rail yard lantern, he looked even more exhausted than she realized inside the store. His beard carried tiny pieces of ice. His breathing sounded rough from the cold. "You should not be out in this storm," Clara said. Softly, Elias glanced toward the freight yard stretching into darkness beyond them. Empty rail cars groaned quietly in the wind. Storm does not ask permission first. Clara almost smiled despite herself. Then she noticed something nearby beneath the loading platform. A small bedroll. Old coffee tin. Half-burned lantern. Her chest tightened instantly. "You are sleeping here?" Elias followed her eyes without embarrassment. "Sometimes. In this weather?" "Been colder." Clara stared at him in disbelief. 20 years earlier this man saved the town from starving to death. Now he slept beside abandoned freight cars while bankers and ranch owners sat warm beside polished stoves. The unfairness of it settled heavy in her chest. Elias stepped toward the loading platform slowly and lowered himself onto an overturned crate with visible effort. For a moment, he closed his eyes as though the cold had finally reached deeper than he could fight anymore. Clara noticed his hands trembling badly now. Even his breath looked weaker. "You are sick," she whispered. Elias shook his head faintly. "Just tired." But Clara knew the difference. Her mother spent years caring for railroad workers during bad winters. She recognized exhaustion when it crossed into danger. Snow gathered along Elias's shoulders while he sat there quietly beside the tracks. "Why come back at all?" Clara finally asked. Elias opened his eyes slowly. Pale gray beneath the lantern glow. "Wanted to see what became of the place." And a long silence followed. Wind screamed through the empty rail yard, carrying the smell of coal smoke and frozen iron. Elias looked toward the distant lights of town. Town got bigger, he said quietly. People got smaller. Clara lowered her eyes. She could not argue with him. Not after tonight. Not after watching grown men laugh at a freezing stranger while a child stood barefoot outside their window. Elias rubbed one scarred hand slowly against his coat sleeve, trying to warm feeling back into his fingers. Then Clara noticed blood spotting faintly through the old bandage around his wrist, where the burn scars disappeared beneath his sleeve. You are hurt. Elias glanced down briefly. Old railroad injury. It should be looked at. It already was. Years ago. Even now, he said it gently, never wanting pity. That was what unsettled Clara most about him. Men in pain usually demanded the world notice it. Elias Boone carried suffering the way old soldiers carried silence. Quietly, without complaint. Suddenly, a distant church bell rang once through the storm. 8 o'clock. Elias looked toward the sound for a long moment before speaking again. Your mother used to bring coffee down here during winter nights. Clara looked at him sharply. Elias gave a tired smile without humor. Said railroad men forgot they were human after enough cold. Snow drifted harder around them now. Clara stared at the lonely bedroll beneath the loading platform, then back at Elias Boone sitting beneath the lantern light with frost gathering along his coat. And in that moment, she realized something terrible. The town had remembered the legend of Elias Boone for 20 years. But nobody had remembered the man. The snow kept falling around the rail yard in heavy silence while Clara stood beside Elias Boone beneath the swaying lantern light. Somewhere far down the tracks, metal groaned softly in the cold. The entire world smelled like coal smoke, frozen timber, and winter that refused to end. Elias sat quietly on the overturned crate with snow gathering along the brim of his hat again. He looked tired enough to disappear into the storm itself. Clara could not stop staring at the old bedroll beneath the loading platform. Thin blanket, tin cup, small lantern nearly out of oil. That was all the man had. The same man whose money once kept Blackwater Ridge alive. You should come back to the mercantile, Clara said softly. At least until the storm passes. Elias shook his head once. Too crowded. Nobody there would disrespect you now. A faint tired smile crossed his face. That is usually how respect works. Comes after people learn your name. Clara lowered her eyes at that. Snow drifted between them in long white streaks. It should not. Elias looked toward the dark outline of the mountains beyond town. No, he agreed quietly. But it does. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Clara noticed him pressing one hand lightly against his ribs beneath the coat. Pain. He tried to hide it immediately, but she caught the movement. You need a doctor. Doctors cost money. You had enough gold to buy every blanket in my father's store. Elias stared down at the snow-covered ground. Most of that money is gone now. Clara frowned. How? Elias rubbed his scarred wrist slowly before answering. Railroad camps. Flood towns. Burnt farms. Winter comes hard for a lot of folks out west. Clara looked at him in disbelief. You gave it away? He shrugged faintly. Money moves easier than grief. Those words settled deep into the cold night around them. Clara suddenly understood something important. Elias Boone was not poor because life cheated him. He was poor because every time he saw suffering, he handed pieces of himself away until little remained. Wind rattled the loading platform overhead. Elias coughed roughly into his sleeve once, low and deep. Clara's worry sharpened immediately. How long have you been traveling like this? Long enough. Without family. Elias went still for a second. His eyes remained fixed on the storm beyond the tracks. Had a wife once. Clara waited quietly. Influenza winter, he murmured. Long time ago. The sadness in his voice barely rose above the wind, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Clara felt her chest ache hearing it. Suddenly, the lonely bedroll beneath the platform made terrible sense. Some people stopped building homes after losing the only person who made one matter. The church bell rang again faintly through the storm. 9 o'clock now. Elias slowly pushed himself upright from the crate, though the movement clearly hurt him. You should head back before the streets freeze worse, he said. And you? I will manage. Clara almost argued again before noticing something strange near the edge of the platform. A weathered wooden box half buried beneath snow. The lid sat slightly open. Inside were old letters tied carefully with twine, and one faded photograph protected beneath cloth. Elias noticed her looking. For the first time all night, genuine hesitation crossed his face. Clara gently lifted the photograph. Her breath caught immediately. It showed a younger Elias Boone standing beside several starving townspeople in front of unfinished buildings nearly buried in snow. Men, women, children. And standing near the center beside him was Clara's mother as a young woman, holding coffee tins in both hands. Across the bottom someone had written in faded ink, "Winter of 1863. The weak Blackwater Ridge survived." Clara looked up slowly. "My mother kept this." Elias nodded faintly. "She gave it to me before I left town." Clara's fingers tightened around the old photograph while snow drifted across the tracks around them. Then she noticed another detail hidden near the corner of the picture. A little boy stood beside Elias Boone holding his hand. Clara looked back at Elias in confusion. Who was that child? Elias stared at the photograph for a long silent moment. And when he finally answered, his voice sounded older than the storm itself. "My son." The wind moved softer for a moment after Elias spoke, as though even the storm itself had gone quiet out of respect for the memory standing beside the tracks. Clara held the old photograph carefully in both hands while snow drifted across its faded edges. The little boy beside Elias could not have been older than 6. Thin winter coat. Serious eyes. One hand gripping Elias Boone's rough fingers tightly, while hungry townspeople stood behind them waiting for flour and coffee. Clara looked back up slowly. What was his name? Elias stared at the photograph without blinking. Samuel. The way he said it carried years inside a single word. Clara lowered her voice instinctively. What happened to him? Elias did not answer right away. Far down the tracks, a loose metal chain knocked softly against a freight car in the wind. Snow hissed across the frozen ground around them. Finally, Elias reached out and gently took the photograph from Clara's hands. "Winter fever," he murmured. Clara felt her chest tighten immediately. Every western town knew winter fever. Some survived it. Some buried entire families because of it. Elias looked down at the faded image for another long moment before carefully placing it back into the wooden box beneath the platform. "Same year my wife died." Clara suddenly understood why he wandered. Why no place ever became home again. Some grief hollowed men slowly until all they could do was keep moving before silence swallowed them whole. Elias closed the lid gently over the box. After that, he said quietly, the road felt easier than staying anywhere long. Snow gathered along his shoulders again while he sat beneath the lantern light. Clara studied him carefully now. Beneath the exhaustion and scars sat something else she had not fully seen before. Loneliness. Deep enough to freeze a man from the inside. "You came back because of them," she said softly. Elias gave a faint nod. "Wanted to see the town one more time before." He stopped himself. Clara frowned immediately. "Before what?" Elias looked out toward the mountains again. "Before the road ends." The answer chilled her worse than the storm. Suddenly his coughing, the weakness in his hands, the exhaustion in his breathing. None of it felt temporary anymore. Clara knelt beside the crate slightly, so she could see his face beneath the brim of his hat. "You are ill." Elias smiled faintly without humor. "Doctor in Cheyenne called it railroad lung. Can it be treated?" "Not much." Clara felt anger rise unexpectedly in her chest then. Not at Elias. At the unfairness of it. The man who spent years helping strangers now sat alone beneath a freezing rail platform, waiting quietly for his life to run out while the town he once saved forgot him completely. "Does anybody know you are here?" she asked. Elias shook his head. Never planned on staying long enough for that. The lantern above them flickered wildly as another hard gust rolled through the yard. Clara pulled her coat tighter around herself while Elias slowly pressed a fist against his chest to steady another cough. Then, from somewhere behind them, footsteps crunched through the snow. Clara turned sharply. Walter Whitmore emerged from the storm carrying a heavy wool coat over one arm and a metal coffee thermos in the other hand. He looked older than he had inside the store earlier that evening. Smaller somehow. The proud merchant. Expression was gone now. He stopped several feet away from Elias beneath the lantern light. Snow covered his hat and shoulders. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter held out the coat awkwardly toward Elias. "You left before I could thank you properly," he said quietly. Elias looked at the coat but did not take it. Walter swallowed hard. "Truth is," he continued, "there would not even be a Blackwater Ridge without you." Elias lowered his eyes briefly. Town built itself. Walter shook his head slowly. No. It survived because one man crossed a mountain pass, while everybody else stayed home waiting for spring. Silence settled again between them. Then Walter looked down at the snow near his boots before speaking softer than Clara had ever heard him speak in his life. And tonight, while we stood warm inside my store, you were still the only man in town acting like people mattered more than money. Walter Whitmore's words disappeared slowly into the storm around the rail yard. Snow drifted through the lantern light in long white ribbons while Elias Boone remained seated beside the loading platform, one scarred hand resting against his chest beneath the old coat. For a moment nobody moved. Clara stood between the two men, feeling the strange weight of history settling over all three of them. 20 years earlier, one man crossed frozen mountains to save a starving town. Now that same man sat exhausted beside abandoned railcars while the town he rescued slept warm behind locked doors. Walter stepped closer carefully, the heavy wool coat still folded over his arm. You should not be out here tonight, he said quietly. Elias gave a faint, tired smile. Seems I have heard that a lot lately. Walter lowered his eyes briefly. Maybe because folks finally started noticing. The answer carried shame inside it. Real shame. Clara had never heard her father speak that way before. Elias looked toward the snow-covered streets beyond the tracks. People notice suffering easier once they know a name attached to it. Walter flinched slightly at the words. Neither man raised his voice. Neither needed to. The truth already sounded heavy enough beneath the storm. Clara watched her father slowly unscrew the lid from the coffee thermos he brought from the store. Steam curled immediately into the freezing air. He held it out awkwardly toward Elias. Coffee, he muttered. Still hot. Elias hesitated before accepting it with both trembling hands. For a brief second the warmth touched his face like something he had not felt in a long while. He took one careful sip, closed his eyes, then nodded once. Your wife used to make coffee this strong too, he murmured. Walter stared at him. Mary. Elias nodded faintly. She always said weak coffee made hard winters feel longer. Clara looked between them in surprise. Hearing her mother's name spoken beneath a railroad lantern beside falling snow felt almost unreal. Walter gave a rough breath that almost sounded like a laugh. That sounds like her. Silence returned after that. But it no longer felt cruel. Only tired. Human. Snow piled higher around the tracks, while distant wind rattled loose metal somewhere farther down the rail yard. Then Walter slowly reached inside his coat pocket and removed several folded papers protected beneath leather. Clara immediately recognized them. Property records. Loan agreements. Old debt transfers from the store. Walter looked at the papers for a long moment before holding them toward Elias. I checked the ledger again after you left, he said quietly. Legally speaking, Whitmore Mercantile still belongs to you. Clara's breath caught. Elias looked down at the papers without surprise, almost as though he already knew. Walter continued carefully. That debt was never repaid. My father kept delaying settlement after the famine winter. Then the railroad fire happened, and everybody believed you were dead. Snow hissed softly across the ground around them. Elias finally lifted his eyes toward Walter. And after folks thought I died. Walter swallowed hard. Truth. Elias nodded once. Walter stared into the storm. People stopped talking about repayment because surviving became easier than remembering. The honesty in those words hurt more than excuses ever could. Clara watched Elias closely, expecting anger at last. Some bitterness. Some demand for justice after 20 years. Instead, Elias simply handed the papers back untouched. Keep the store, he said softly. Walter blinked in disbelief. Elias, town needs it more than I do. Walter stared at him speechless. Clara felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. Even now, even after humiliation, after loneliness, after sleeping beside freight crates in winter cold, Elias Boone still refused to take anything for himself. He lifted the thermos again slowly, warming his hands against the metal before speaking toward the snow-covered town lights beyond the tracks. Funny thing about ownership, he murmured. Most folks think owning something means having your name on paper. He glanced once toward the mercantile far down Main Street, glowing warmly through the storm. But the things that matter most, his tired gray eyes drifted toward the memory of the little girl wrapped in the red blanket earlier that night. Those belong to whoever still remembers how to care for people. Snow continued falling across Blackwater Ridge long past midnight. The storm no longer sounded angry, only endless. White drifts swallowed wagon tracks, rooftops, and empty streets beneath the pale glow of oil lanterns. Beneath the railroad platform, Clara sat beside Elias Boone, while Walter stood nearby holding the untouched property papers loosely at his side. Nobody seemed eager to move anymore. The cold had stripped away too many pretenses for that. Elias stared quietly into the darkness beyond the tracks, one hand wrapped around the warm coffee thermos Walter brought him. Steam curled upward through the lantern light in thin silver ribbons. Clara noticed he had stopped shivering quite as hard now, but exhaustion still clung to him like another layer of winter. Walter finally folded the papers slowly and tucked them back into his coat pocket. "You really mean to walk away from all of it?" he asked quietly. Elias looked toward him with calm gray eyes. "What would I do owning a mercantile?" Walter gave a weak breath through his nose. "Most men would collect every dollar owed them." Elias stared out toward town again. "Most men are afraid there will never be enough." The words settled heavily into the freezing air. Clara thought about the store filled with expensive coats, polished shelves, and customers guarding warmth like it belonged only to them. Then she looked at Elias Boone sitting beneath a railroad lantern after giving away the finest blanket in town to a freezing child without hesitation. The difference between wealth and goodness suddenly seemed very large. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang softly through the snow. Midnight. Elias closed his eyes briefly at the sound. "Long day," he murmured. Clara studied him carefully. His breathing had grown shallower over the last hour. Every few moments he pressed his fist lightly against his chest before relaxing again, as though trying not to worry anyone. "You need somewhere warm tonight," she said firmly. Elias shook his head immediately. "I have my place here." Clara looked around at the frozen rail yard in disbelief. "This is not a place." Elias gave a tired half-smile. "Been enough." Walter suddenly stepped forward before Clara could answer. "Come stay at the mercantile," he said quietly. Elias looked up at him in surprise. Walter rubbed one hand across the back of his neck awkwardly. "Storage room upstairs has a stove. Real bed, too." Elias remained silent. Walter lowered his eyes toward the snow beneath his boots. "Truth is," he hesitated, "I do not think I could sleep tonight knowing the man who saved this town froze beside my railroad platform." The honesty in his voice carried no pride, only regret. Elias studied Walter for a long moment while snow drifted through the lantern light around them. Finally, he spoke softly. "You already gave me coffee." Walter almost laughed sadly at that. "And 20 years ago, you gave my family a town." Silence settled again. Then Clara noticed movement near the edge of the rail yard. Small figures walking carefully through the storm, carrying lanterns. Within seconds, more shapes appeared behind them. Townspeople. The rancher from the store. Old Mr. Dobbins. Martha Green holding her little girl wrapped in the red blanket. Even men who laughed at Elias earlier now crossed through the snow toward the loading platform one by one without speaking much. Clara looked at her father in surprise. Walter shrugged faintly. Word spreads fast during winter. Martha Green stepped forward first. Tears glistened in her eyes from cold and emotion both. "My daughter would have frozen tonight," she whispered. Elias looked uncomfortable receiving gratitude. "She just needed something warm." Martha shook her head gently. "No," she said. She needed someone who noticed her. More townspeople gathered slowly beneath the falling snow, hats lowered respectfully beneath the lantern glow. Nobody cared about the storm anymore. Nobody hurried home. For the first time in years, Blackwater Ridge looked less like a town protecting itself from winter and more like a town remembering how to stand together inside it. Elias Boone watched them quietly from beneath the railroad platform while snow drifted softly around the crowd. Then Clara saw something she had not seen once all night. Real warmth reached his tired eyes at last. The storm finally began to weaken sometime after midnight. Snow still drifted across the rail yard, but the hard, screaming wind had softened into long, cold whispers moving through the tracks and freight cars. Lantern light flickered over the gathered townspeople standing beneath the loading platform, while Elias Boone sat quietly among them, holding the warm coffee thermos between scarred hands. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Not because of the weather anymore. Because something forgotten had returned to Blackwater Ridge that night, and people were afraid it might disappear again if they walked away too soon. Martha Green wrapped the red blanket tighter around her little girl and stepped closer to Elias. "She has not stopped talking about you," Martha said softly. The child peeked shyly from beneath the thick wool and held up the oversized glove Elias gave her earlier. "Mama says you are the railroad cowboy." A few quiet smiles moved through the crowd. Elias looked almost embarrassed by the attention. "Your mama says a lot of things better than I do." The little girl studied him seriously for a second. "Are you cold?" The question settled gently over everyone standing there. Elias glanced down at the missing glove on his own hand before, giving the child a faint smile. Not as cold as before. Clara watched the people around him carefully then. Men who once laughed at him now stood silently removing scarves, gloves, even extra coats from their shoulders without a word. One rancher stepped forward and placed a wool blanket beside Elias's bedroll beneath the platform. Another man set down a sack of food quietly near the crate. Nobody announced what they were doing. Nobody tried to look noble. That was the strange beauty of shame when it finally became honest. It made people kinder without asking for applause. Walter Whitmore looked out over the crowd with tired eyes. "Tomorrow morning," he said slowly, "every widow in town gets coal from my supply shed. No charge." Several heads turned toward him in surprise. Walter rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Long overdue." Old Mr. Dobbins nodded once. "I will send over flour. I have extra firewood," another man muttered. "Take some blankets from my stock," said a woman near the back. Clara felt something loosen inside her chest hearing it happen. Not grand speeches. Not miracles. Just people finally remembering each other again. Elias listened quietly while snow drifted through the lantern light around them. Then he looked toward Clara with tired gray eyes carrying more warmth than before. "Your mother would have liked this." Clara swallowed hard. She always said winter showed people who they really were. Elias nodded faintly. Looks like she was right. Silence followed again, but now it felt peaceful instead of heavy. Somewhere down the tracks a train whistle echoed low through the mountains. Elias lifted his eyes toward the sound. Long distant. Lonely. Clara suddenly realized what it meant. "You are leaving," she whispered. Elias looked back toward the town glowing softly beyond the snowfall. "Was planning to." Clara felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. "And now?" Elias glanced at the people gathered around the loading platform. The ranchers. The widows. The child wrapped in red wool. Walter Whitmore standing quietly with lowered eyes. For the first time all night, Elias Boone truly looked at home somewhere. He breathed slowly into the cold air before answering. "Now I might stay until the snow melts." Relief moved softly through the crowd like warmth returning to frozen hands. Nobody cheered. Nobody needed to. Clara watched snow settle along the brim of Elias Boone's hat while lantern light flickered across his tired face. 20 years earlier, he crossed a mountain pass to save Blackwater Ridge from winter. But standing there beneath the railroad platform, Clara realized something even more important. The town had not saved Elias Boone that night. Elias Boone had saved the town one more time. Because out in the West, the worst thing a man could lose was never money or land. It was the ability to see another freezing soul and still remember they mattered.